let's go to the beginning. Talk about beginnings, where it started. How did we get to this prize?
Well, the first time I ever tried to write a novel, I was 10. So
It's a
this
long
was a
time.
long way back. I don't think I got more than like half a chapter in, but back in those days, I was a lot more interested in reading than writing.
Mm.
But I kept coming back to the idea of writing. I
Mm.
enjoyed the process.
Mm.
And during my university days, I was about 21, 22. I had it in my head that, I could probably do this seriously. So I wrote stories that I sent off to magazines and I submitted for the editors to publish. I didn't have success for a long time because, of course, you're a young, raw writer, you're developing your skills.
Yeah.
But it was important to be in the process,
Mm-hmm.
to be taking the process seriously.
Mm.
So you'd get those rejection letters back, emails back from these editors at like Asimov Science Fiction magazine. They don't want your story. Well, fine, I'll write another one. And finally, around 2006-07, I finally got a couple accepted into small print anthologies. And right around that time, I started to get stuff accepted into the Guyana Annual and win prizes.
Right.
So that was encouraging. But these were still short stories.
Right. Right.
And in my computer, I was writing lots of notes. I have at least 20 ideas, 20 outlines for novels in my computer that have built up over the last 20 years.
Which is good groundwork.
Right, but
Yeah.
so you think of this would be a novel, this would be a novel, this would be a short story, but you only feel like you have time to write the short story.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So last year, I think it was you who called me up and said, look, we have this Burt Award workshop. They want
Yes.
people who are interested in writing for younger audiences. They're going to give you guidelines and help you out. So I came up, and the workshop was being run by a few different people, but mostly Mr. Richard Scrimger, a Canadian author. And the first day, he gave us homework. He said, okay, the first day we talked about how to write a good opening, among other things. And for homework, he said, go home, write an opening, come back tomorrow, we'll present it to each other, and we'll talk about how your opening looks and what changes you can make. And what I wrote, it started with this image of a girl hiding with a knife. And I wrote an opening scene based on that. I had no idea why she was hiding, who she was hiding from. I had none of that. But I wrote the scene and I brought it in. And I got a good reaction. And I built the story off of that. And I ended up with a whole novel. It took months from that point to think to yourself, well, where should she come from? What should she do when she gets here? When she gets here, who should she meet first? Who should she meet second? And what will they do when they meet her? Will they help her? Will they help her a lot? Will they obstruct her? So it took months of just thinking about that while doing the daily tasks. You're brushing your teeth and you're going, But the deadline, they had a deadline. And sadly, my personality is the kind of thing I have is I don't work too hard if I don't have a deadline. So the Burt people had a deadline of October, late October. So late August, I said, okay, I got 2 months. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to actually put this on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote for 2 months in the evenings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, the submission, your manuscript that won the prize, it's called Children of the Spider.
Children of the Spider.
Children of the Spider. It was actually birthed around that workshop.
Yeah, it's the opening scene that's in the manuscript now is the exact opening scene I wrote that night as homework. All I did was clean up the grammar.
What is your particular interest, though, in writing?
I've always been a fan of mythology,
Mhm.
and I've always been a fan of stuff set in the future. And that seems to be the two ends. And a lot of the times I write and I realize I'm bringing the two ends together. And you'll see the mythological characters popping up in some form in a future time
Mm-hmm.
because they're so good and they lasted through time because they have characteristics. You look at these ancient stories of, say, Ram and Sita,
Mm-hmm.
or Anansi, or the Greek gods, Jupiter, the Roman gods, Zeus, and his many children, and different ways they get into conflict. So I put some of that stuff into this book. because I love that action and drama from the mythologies, and then I bring it into I bring it forward into our modern world,
Yeah.
and even in a little bit looking towards the future, because
Yeah.
some of what happens in what is supposed to be the modern world in the book, it's using technological advances that you wouldn't really have. So it's a bit futuristic. So you get these two sections mixing together. This isn't the first time I've done it, but it's the culmination of a trend, or maybe the continuation of a trend, because the culmination might be
Yeah.
later on.
Let's talk about the children of the spider.
Is there anything particular you want to know?
No, just give me the synopsis of the book, and then we'll look at it against the backdrop of all that you've said, the sci-fi mixed with mythology, the local culture, because it's set in the sky and it's set in part of Guyana.
The first thing I should say is the book was constrained by what Burt said they wanted. They said they wanted a Caribbean book that looked at Caribbean life with Caribbean characters. At least the spirit of the book had to be that. You could put it on another planet, but it still had to be Caribbean in the feel.
Good.
So I began with that scene, and I started to say, okay, this person is going to leave an ancient dimension, an other world, and come to Guyana. What's going to be very important to a person who comes to Guyana for the first time, who's never seen humanity before? What's going to obstruct them? What's going to trip them up? What will they like and what will they hate? What will give them a hard time? And you still have the magical elements, but a big part of the book is the adjustment. This is the main character is a teenage girl. She looks Amerindian, and very early in the book we find out that she actually is descended from Amerindians of Guyana who were kidnapped and taken to that world, and she's escaped back into Guyana. So she's actually Guyanese. But she has no memory of this because she grew up elsewhere. And so we have her with a goal. She's trying to find her father, who she thinks is in Guyana somehow. Her mother is dead. She finds a local boy who she ends up in Mabaruma to begin with. And I wanted that deliberately because rather than just throw her into the middle of Georgetown, for instance, I wanted her to start out in an area where she was a little bit outside the action, so she could come with the reader at her side. And then she would pick up allies, move along, and by the time she got to Georgetown...
And learn and understand
the
culture and the people.
So the reader's journey would parallel her journey into the heart of the country. Well, I don't know if we can qualify Georgetown as the heart of the country. I think every section of the country probably wants to say we are the heart of the country. So let me not go there.
Right.
But we are at least the brains of the country here in Georgetown.
Yeah. Well, the seat of government.
Right. So she starts out with one ally, and she gets on a ferry, and she's coming to Georgetown from the hinterland. And we slowly build up a picture of Guyana and Guyanese culture. And I tried very carefully to show the Guyana that I know without being critical or without being worshipful.
It's not a travel log by any chance.
I don't want to be trying to pull tourists into Guyana with this book. So we see a lot of the what we call tourist attractions of Guyana. They pass by Shell Beach, for instance. We see the jungle. We get Stabroek Market. There's a big scene there. But we go Kaijua Falls. We have a scene there. But I don't at any point try to make this scenic. And then
take away from your story.
But then on the other hand, I don't want to be very dark about it either. I don't want to say, look at how much crime and poverty and stuff we have in Guyana. But we do have that. So one of the people they meet is an orphan living on the street. He has a history with drugs. He has constant run-ins with corrupt policemen. So the idea of, drugs, street life, corrupt policemen, that's a Guyanese reality.
Right.
But I'm not preaching about how bad things is, that the Guyana is bad. I don't want that either. The focus of the book is on the action. I just want that to be a background that makes it look like a real place. If you make it look too much like a tourist brochure, oh, look at the wonderful cathedral, or look at, that becomes distracting and the action suffers
Yes.
because it doesn't feel like you're in a real place.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you make it too gloomy
Yeah.
and you just go, look how miserable Guyana is, then again you distract people because they're just paying attention to just the background.
It's not germane to the plot.
Right.
Right. So you just move through.
And that's a good point you make. What is germane? So that, for instance, the boy they meet who has a drug problem, that becomes an issue in the second half of the book for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you have a drug addict on your team, that's problematic.
Two things. What were you reading? Your interest in reading, and if there are any influences.
Well, I was always attracted to stories that explore things. So one of the first sets of books I had as a child, this was the 80s, books weren't too common and we'd borrow, but the books I treasured, they were these books that would tell you about how children lived in Malaysia and they would tap rubber. There was another book about a boy who rounded up sheep on his father's farm in New Zealand. You know, things like this. Like, oh, there's a whole big world out there. There were a series of books with two brothers who would go to the South Seas, or they would go to the Amazon or the Congo, and they'd catch gorillas and giant iguanas and things like that. And the idea of going out into the world, which I couldn't do at that time, but they were doing it for me, those books captured my imagination. And along the way, I discovered also an attraction to the fantastic, things that bent reality or broke reality. And it's very innocent. You find them in children's stories all the time. We read fairy tales, Cinderella, there's magic.
Yes.
You have Pinocchio, magic. It's all those children's stories are full of magic because magic is very inspirational. And you'd also find the beastly, monstrous things in there, like the beast in the story Beauty and the Beast. Or there'd be dragons.
Right.
And these monstrous things that you would often have to fight. The idea of fighting these monstrous things was always fun.
One of the greatest thing around right now, young adult writing, is the Harry Potter series.
Right.
Keep going.
Right. Well, the Harry Potter series is a good example. You know, you have the Dementors, who are these evil things that will drive you crazy. You have huge trolls. You have dragons again. Dragons are very common. So, when I was about 10 or 11, I discovered Stephen King. My mother thought it would drive me crazy. She kept telling me, don't read that stuff. You're going to poison your mind. So I started reading Stephen King at around 11. I started reading a lot of military and spy thriller stuff around that age. Alistair MacLean, Tom Clancy. And these were fast-paced stuff. And it's sometimes looked down on in the culture that you're reading what is called pulp fiction. It's thrillers, it's action. There's the stereotype that it doesn't have much thought behind it. It's not cultural, I think would be the word some people might use. But I found it amazingly enjoyable.
Right.
And from Stephen King, I branched out into people like Neil Gaiman. He wrote comic books at first. I love comic books, Superman, Batman. And then you get this stuff that's not superhero, that it's fantasy, it's world building, it's monstrosities. Neil Gaiman wrote a lot of that stuff for what was called Vertigo Comics. And I enjoyed that stuff so much. He started writing novels, I followed it.
So all this while you've been developing as a writer. I mean, if you were able to see these things and ask questions, you were developing. You had a question in mind. You know, as you said just now, you were able to say what worked in the story, what did not work.
Oh, well, you mean like analyzing it?
Yes.
Well, one thing that helped is I ended up at UG. I considered myself on the path to becoming a teacher. So I did an English degree at UG. And I learned a lot there in terms of just studying literature. And I read a lot of books I would usually not read. Because like I said, I was always attracted to the more action-oriented stories. And then you would sit me down in a classroom and say, read The Color Purple. And I would read The Color Purple, or Their Eyes Were Watching God. And these are stories that don't have, a lot of fight scenes or anything like that. They don't have spies.
But no
it's
action.
Very much more focused on realities of life. And I still enjoyed those books. And I would not have picked those books up on my own.
during your claiming of your prize, you've met an author that I admire also. She's got some roots in Guyana, Nalo Hopkinson. Talk about that meeting.
Um, there's not much to say about the meeting because she was very busy at the time. I can tell you about the books.
Tell about the book, The Influence.
Right. Well, Universal Bookstore, which some of us may remember, had a very thick anthology of African American literature called Dark Matter, and it was all science fiction by black authors.
Dark Matter.
Dark matter. Dark matter is a scientific, an astronomical term, or actually astronomy term. So I read many of the stories in there, and then I, without warning, came upon this story in the middle of the book that was about an old hag in Trinidad. It just was magical. So number one, it was a good story. But number two, it was an old hag story in a book that was mostly about America. And I said, okay, let me get into this. Mm-hmm. And it so happened at the time I was at UG studying feminist literature, and it dovetailed right in because the story had a very feminist point of view about the way men only respect women for their youth. And you have these two women, one young, one old. And the old hag well, actually I should say three women, because there's the older woman, the middle-aged woman, and then there's the young baby. And the young baby is being attacked by this old hag. And so there's all this pressure that comes into the life of a woman to look young, be sexy. And the old hag lives forever as long as they keep sucking blood. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you can see why a woman would turn willingly to be an old hag if they could keep that power for themselves, right, to go back to being young. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so that's a very political thing to have in a book about a zombie, basically. And I like that she could fit that social politics
seamlessly into it, right.
And then we get to the end of the book, and here's where my kind of story, you see, has an action scene at the end, and there is a fight. A lot of the other stories that are what's called literary fiction, the conflict is up here.
Yeah.
And that's good.
Right, right.
But usually there's no conflict here. So I sometimes kind of zone out. I don't pay so much attention when there's a conflict in the head. You know, so like a lot of the what would we call literature books. Like say
literary.
So a book like Biswas, which is a good book, I've read it dozens of times. But there's no fight at the end of Biswas in terms of him fighting somebody for something. The fight is all about him resolving something within his spirit. Uh-huh. And it's a good struggle for him to have. But me personally, I like to have something physical at the end, just maybe that demonstrates how the conflict is closing off. So I like that she put that into her book.
Short stories or short fiction for children. Let's talk a bit about, I remember a number of stories there, Hunting the Red Jaguar. There's a red jaguar, The Secret World, The Bring Back Machine is a lovely one, and The Runaway Train. Talk quickly about those 4 stories and the Guyana Annual.
I think what happens with something like the Guyana Annual is that it's the spirit of yourself as a writer. When you see your books in print and you know people are reading them, it really gives you that push to keep going. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You sometimes feel like a man in the bottom of a basement and you don't know if there's even a world outside as you write. Who's going to see this thing? Yeah. Who wants to see it?
Right, right.
I'm not sure I could say that I've been a good marketer or that I can see myself getting marketed in any particular way that I've ever been published in. Mm-hmm. But I do know for the personality of a writer, when you see something with your name on it there, that drives you forward.
Gives you some.
For instance, you talk about Hunting the Red Jaguar. It's a book that has illness in it. The boy is trying to save his father's life, and he's been told that if he finds this red jaguar and kills it and takes the bones, he can grind those bones to make medicine that will heal his father. And he's faced with this choice. Do I kill this magnificent animal? Can I even kill it? First of all, the idea, can he even kill a jaguar? He's a boy.
You didn't even find it.
But the idea that if he finds this wonderful, rare treasure, he must kill it to save something else that's important. You know, that's topical to Guyana. We're talking about issues.
Choices and.
We're talking about issues in our society along those same lines. Should we cut down the forest for the money? Should we dig up the land for the gold? Should we farm where the forest used to be? Should we, you know, so, and that's just the nature argument, because the jaguar is a nature symbol.
Yeah.
But you could take it out of nature and you could go into other areas of society.
Right. And this is one of the things science fiction can do also. It's not just a story, what is behind that story. All right? The theme behind the story, go on.
Right.
If you can weave some of the reality, the real issue, the topical issues of the day in that science fiction.
Right, so that was one of the fantasy stories I wrote. I also wrote the very first story I won the Josiah Prize for. You didn't mention it, but that was also fantasy. It was, or I think you did, The Railway in the Sky.
Oh, The Railway in the Sky.
And that was based on, we're almost at election time, so it's very topical for then. Because I set it in a world that's very similar to Guyana, except it's a small island. And instead of black and Indian, which is our primary racial conflict, I set up a society that had blue people and green people. And the idea was, for us in reality here in Guyana, we would look at blue people and green people, and we would think, they're all weird. Why blue and green got to fight each other? They're both aliens and weird.
Yes, yeah.
So I set it up to have a blue child and a green child who are from opposite ends of this society that's divided, get on this railway that goes up. And then they're up there, high above the world, and they look down and they see where they came from. And it's a little place. And all the people are sharing it, and you can't tell from up there. Now, I don't preach this. I don't ever actually write down, oh, look at how small the world is, or look at how everyone is small compared to the world.
You show it in your...
I never actually say these words that conflict is insignificant when looked at from afar. But it's there underneath the story. And the symbolism is clear. As these children rise up out of this society and look back at it, it's just the two of them up there as two people. They deal with each other as two people. And they look back at the world they came from, and they realize that that world, with all its biases and prejudices and the things they told us about each other, that world is so small and far behind us. We don't need it. Or at least that world can't tell us who we are to each other.
It is nice chatting with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.